Hello, my darlings. Madame Raven here with a wonderful story for you that, of course, I was drawn to. It's by Admiral Cloudberg, and it's called Follow the Raven. I live to experience wilderness. It's basically my version of cocaine. And once in a while, something happens out there that leaves me wondering for years afterwards. That's part of what makes me keep coming back. But there's one place I know I will never return to. I'm not really sure why I decided to go to the Queen Charlotte Islands. Looking back, I think it was because I saw them on a map and was intrigued by their remote location. For those who don't know, the islands, also called Haida Gwaii, are located many miles off the west coast of British Columbia, close to Alaska. The islands cover a size the area of Lebanon, but are home to fewer than 5,000 people. Perfect for a wilderness adventurer like me. There are a few trails and even fewer roads that intrude upon their dense forests, narrow fjords, and jagged mountains. I simply couldn't resist its calling. And so that summer I found myself on an early morning flight out over the tumultuous Hecate Strait, toward the wild lands of Haida Gwaii. I thought it was fitting that this body of water was named for Hecate, the Greek goddess of magic. My arrival at the little airport at Sandspits precipitated a frenzied rush of activity. Since I intended to enter Gwaii Hanana National Park, I had to be given an orientation, which an aging park warden with a twitchy ear doled out to me and 2 or 3 other newly arrived tourists. He quickly handed over the presentation to a pre-recorded video, which featured a monotone narration describing the park's mission and rules as pictures of the natural landscape drifted by, accompanied by tinny classical music. Since the park was established in part to preserve the inhabitants, the Haida people, it spoke of the 2 clans, Raven and Eagle, and how members of each clan can only marry a member of the other. I vaguely remember a long discussion of the 6 types of totem poles. I sat through it without much thought, waiting for the orientation to end so I could get away from it all. If you haven't figured this out already, I don't like people. I like plants and rocks and water. Animals are all right. Mercifully, the orientation eventually ended, and the old park warden escorted me to the seaplane I had chartered to take me to my start point, and to pick me up at my endpoint 2 days later. I was introduced to the pilot, John, who was Haida. He gave me a hearty handshake and welcomed me aboard. "You're my only passenger today," he told me, showing a gap-toothed smile. "You going down to Sac Bay?" "Yeah," I said, hefting my pack into the empty seat. "You know where and when to pick me up, right?" "Of course," he said with a wave of his hand. "It'll be interesting crossing through that area, you know. It's rough country." "That's why I picked it," I said as I climbed into the plane. "Easy means boring." "You chose well, then." John undid the mooring and hopped up into the pilot seat. "There are many lakes and mountains along your route." I was well aware of this, so I decided to change the subject. "Do you speak Haida?" I asked him. "Vidagidlang Salangda," he said with a chuckle. "No, not really. Hardly anyone can speak it anymore." John gunned the motor and eased the boat out onto the bay. Fortunately, visitors wrote down many Haida tales told by the elders, who knew the time before the white man. The seaplane sputtered down the length of the bay and took to the air like an overburdened goose. John put the plane into a dizzyingly steep right bank and headed south, flying low along the shores of the Moresby Island. I noticed that hanging from the ceiling he had a wood carving of what appeared to be a stylized bird. Although I wasn't genuinely curious, I asked him about it to humor him. "That's Raven," he explained. "He's the trickster, the mischief maker. but also the friend of mankind. There is a raven within everyone you know. I raised an eyebrow. What did ravens ever do for humanity? Raven released the sun from its box and coaxed into the sky the stars and the moon. He floated on a tiny raft on an endless ocean, and he grew the raft into the earth. He split it in two, and the smaller piece became Haida Gwaii, and the larger piece became the mainland. One day he was lonely, and so he released humans from a cockle shell upon the beach. He changes and invents, but he never makes or destroys. He is evil and greedy, but he will help you in your time of need. Are there other gods? I asked, gazing through the window as the forest and rocks drift in and out of the fog. There is Tuxekt, who embodies violent death, and Tia, who embodies peaceful death. There is Zalakahord of the frogs and the volcanoes, and her husband, Kaiti of bears. There is Gilfipet of the forest, Lagua, who showed iron to the Haida, and Sins of the sky. I was only half listening. Let's hope I don't run into Takeks then, I joked. Don't say such things, John scolded. Takeks and Tia are a duality, two halves of the same god. To speak of one is to speak of both. I should have guessed. John didn't seem too perturbed by my comments on the death god, however, and he quickly launched into a series of stories about anthropomorphic hills and bears taking Haida women as their wives. In the meantime, I struggled to catch a glimpse of the forest and the islands below through the swirling clouds. I knew that it rains on Haida Gwaii on 2 out of every 3 days, and I'd prepared for it extensively, but I was still having a hard time convincing myself that I would like it. I knew we were close to my destination when John made another right turn and initiated a heart-stopping descent down into a fjord. "This is it," he said. "Sac Bay." The plane's twin pontoon thumped onto the still surface of the water, sending spray up the side of the fuselage. John coasted the float plane down to a walking pace. "There's no dock here," he told me as we approached the head of the fjord. "You'll just have to step onto the pontoon and jump ashore." That would hardly be a problem for me. I've had to jump long distances in much worse terrain, with risk of death if I fell short. So John's warning almost felt like a slight. John pulled the plane up alongside a boulder that jutted out into deeper water and turned around to look at me. "Good luck out there," he said. Reaching around for a handshake, I took his proffered hand and winced as he nearly broke half my fingers. When he let go, I shouldered my pack and stepped out onto the gently swaying pontoon. And just like that, one foot went out from under me and I was in the water. I grabbed onto the boulder as I went down, saving myself from complete immersion, but I was totally soaked up to the middle of my thigh. John leaned out of the window of the plane and said, "I told you to be careful," he joked. "You'll have to change out of those or you'll get hypothermia." I knew that all too well, so fortunately I'd brought a second pair, but I wasn't about to change into it until John had left, so I waited on the small rocky beach at the head of the fjord. John made a 3-point turn and gunned it back down the narrow inlet. When he finally took off and disappeared into the fog, I'd changed into dry pants, put on my rain jacket, and entered the forest. The trees were densely packed and heavily coated in moss. The sound of dripping water was constant, along with the burble of a nearby stream. The undergrowth proved to be a formidable obstacle, but I struggled through it, crashing over ferns and broadleaf bushes that sent stagnant water droplets running down my legs. I passed a lake, fighting my way around a brush-choked margins and on into the valley behind it. I stung my hand on some sort of nettle which was growing everywhere, exacerbating the already uncomfortable situation, and that was before I noticed that my rain jacket had snagged on something and water was leaking down the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the trees and undergrowth thinned out as I trekked higher up the valley. Nevertheless, when I reached the wide pass at the back of the valley, I called it quits and made camp. I was soaking wet and covered in stinging plant hairs, so it was a relief to dry off and hang out inside my tent. I ate dinner cold and settled in for the night. Because of the high latitude, there was a very long period of twilight before it got truly dark, but when it did, it was pitch black. The clouds blocked most of the light, and the trees blocked the rest. It was probably the darkest night I'd ever experienced. Just when I thought I was finally starting to drift off to sleep, I heard a heavily snuffling sound outside the tent. Something was out there. I grabbed my can of bear spray and turned on my light. There was a gruff growl, and I tore open the door of the tent. Bear spray pointed out into the night. Now I know what you're expecting. Some horrible forest creature, right? No, it was just a bear. Of course, if you had told me at that moment it was just a bear, I would have screamed in your face, because a bear in my camp at night is terrifying. Its teeth glinting in the light of my headlamp, and its beady little eyes stared right at me. I went at it with the bear spray, surging out of the tent and sending the caustic liquid right into its face. I didn't want to be trapped in the tent if it attacked, but I also didn't want to have to fight a bear that could see me. To my horror, it didn't back off. Instead, it lunged at me, and I scrambled out of the way just in time. I struggled to my feet and fled as fast as I could. I know you aren't supposed to run from a bear, but in the heat of the moment, it's really hard to stand your ground. Fear takes over, and you bolt. I wasn't even sure that the bear was following me as I tore off through the forest. In that moment of panic, all I wanted to do was get away. I crashed through the undergrowth with little regard for wet leaves or stinging nettle, but then, after a few minutes, I noticed that the clouds were clearing. Dappled moonlight showed down between the branches of the trees, coating the forest floor like liquid silver. I looked around and saw no sign of the bear, so I turned off my light and slowed down to a walking pace. I wasn't sure where I was exactly, but I saw a clearing ahead that I could use to get my bearings. I stepped out into the clearing, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Bathed in the moonlight were 4 huge totem poles. They were all between 40 and 50 feet tall, with a myriad of stylized animals carved into their weighty trunks. A 5th totem pole had fallen over and was lying on its side in the grass. My mind immediately jumped to the orientation video of that morning. There are 6 kinds of totem poles. I couldn't remember all of them off the top of my head, but a single glance told me beyond any doubt which kind these were. They were mortuary poles. At the top of each pole was a coffin-like box, tilted on end, that contained the remains of some distinguished member of hiatus society. The box on the nearest pole had come open, and a skeleton stared out from it. Its bleached bones bathed in moonlight. Its long, spindly fingers seemed to be pointing at something. I was in the clearing for a reason, however, to regain my sense of direction. I saw the silhouette of a mountain rising not far above the clearing, and that was all I needed. I knew the direction of my camp, the direction of the valley, and the direction of Sac Bay. The direction of Sac Bay. That's where the skeleton was pointing, I realized. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound. It had been so silent, and then suddenly it wasn't. I stepped back and saw a skull gazing up from the mud, right where I'd been standing. Its eyeless sockets filled with cold, bubbling water and scurrying insects. I screamed aloud, and my yell was answered by another loud caw. A raven was standing on top of the mortuary pole I had been looking at. It cocked its head and looked down at me, shifting about on its little stick-like legs. "What are you doing up there?" I said aloud.
"Be wary,"
said a male voice somewhere next to me. For the second time in a minute, I nearly had a heart attack. I would have run, but when I saw the man who had spoken, curiosity kept me firmly in place. He was a tall and muscular Haida, decked out in traditional dress, with one key difference. All of his clothing was white. Bathed in moonlight, he seemed to shine like a glow stick against the dark woods behind him. His chiseled chin loomed over powerful biceps and a heavy necklace of bone. I stared at him.
"Do not linger here,"
he told me in perfect English. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I'd fallen asleep on my feet. But when I opened them again, he was still there. "Who are you?" I asked him. He wasn't armed as far as I could tell, and he wasn't hostile, so I figured I'd try to find out what was going on. "Who am I?" "Oh, I'm nobody," came a female voice from the opposite direction. I turned to look and saw a Haida woman, also dressed in white, weaving her way through the marsh grass. Twin braids of silky black hair plunged over her smooth, round shoulders. A long chain of flowers wrapped around her lithe and sinuous frame, and little wooden carvings hung from her ears by golden rings. If I wasn't already in shock, I was now. The woman was beautiful, and if I hadn't been straight as a ruler, I would have said the same about the man. But something about them just felt off. "Nobody?" I said, confused.
"Nobody,"
said the man. They were standing to either side of me now. It made me claustrophobic. "What do you want with me?" I asked them, incredibly nervous.
"You are lost, aren't you?"
the man said.
"Coyote of the Bears chased you far from your camp. We will show you the way."
"I'm not lost," I said. But even as I was saying it, I realized that I was. Hadn't I just regained my bearings moments ago? This didn't make sense. These people shouldn't be here. "We'll take you back," said the woman. "Where is back?"
"Home,"
said the man. "I'm not done with my trek," I said incredulously. "You cannot finish your trek," said the woman. I didn't like the way they were alternating who answered my questions, but I didn't mention it. "Why not?" I asked.
"John is dead,"
said the man.
"There will be no one to retrieve you from these woods. That is our job now."
I felt my heart rate tick up a notch. I needed to get away, but I didn't know where I was anymore. And if John really was dead, how do you know John is dead? The woman spread her lips in a lovely smile. If I hadn't been so creeped out, I would have been smitten. "You saw it happen, didn't you?" she said to the man.
"I did,"
he affirmed. Turning back to me, he said,
"I see many things, terrible and violent things, like Kawag atop the pole. He was stabbed through the heart by a jilted lover."
The woman chimed in with her own tale. "And Saynag, who is on the ground, grew sick and died, surrounded by family." I looked down at the skull on the ground in front of me. It had a name now. I felt sick. "Okay, fine," I said. "Just get me out of here." As I spewed forth my acquiescence, the raven let out another plaintive and swooped down to the land at my feet. The forest couple glanced at it with mild bemusement.
"Come,"
said the man, as he started walking across the meadow. I wish I knew where he was going, but I didn't, and the woman was right behind me, so I couldn't suddenly change my mind. I followed the man and the woman across the meadow and into the forest, and the raven hopped along right beside me, glaring at me with its little beady eyes. It would hop away from me, cock its head, and then hop back again and emit a little like it was trying to show me something. I stopped for a second and leaned down close to it. "What are you doing?" I asked it, in much the same manner as I might speak to a dog that has broken a rule. The raven hopped in place and cocked its head again. "Come along," the woman told me, forcing me to tear my eyes away from the bird, but it kept following me. This was all very strange. And then I remembered the stories John had told me on the plane. It was always about the raven. He is evil and greedy, but he will help you in your time of need. I let out an amused snort at the idea. If this was really my time of need, I didn't see what this dumb bird could do to help. Nevertheless, I decided to press my guides a bit further. Turning to the woman, I said, "Really, who are you? And I won't take nobody for an answer."
"You already know who I am,"
said the man. I had asked the woman, and the man responded. This was really starting to annoy me. And didn't I already know who they were? And then suddenly I realized that I did. The alternating answers, the knowledge of death, it made perfect sense. They were Taxex and Tia, the god of violent death and the god of peaceful death. It wasn't hard to tell which was which.
"I see many things, terrible and violent things,"
Taxex had said. My heart sank. That meant John was definitely dead. He really had seen it. "I see," I said, suddenly wary. Tia leaned in close to my ear. "Beware, Taxex. Follow the raven," she whispered. I was taken aback. I thought she wanted me to follow her and Taxex. I looked away from her, and to my horror, Taxex was gone. And there were now 2 ravens. Which one was I supposed to follow? My blood began to boil when I realized what they had done. Taxex and Tia were a duality, 2 sides of the same god. That's why I would ask a question to one and the other would answer. And when Tia distracted me with her cryptic advice, I had looked away just long enough for Taxex to transform himself into a raven. The 2 identical black birds stared up at me. They both cocked their heads and hopped, beckoning me to follow in 2 different directions. This was hopeless. There was no way to tell them apart. Tia moved in close to my ear again. "Follow the raven," she repeated with a giggle. I looked at the birds, then back at Tia. She stood there with a faint smile on her lips, watching me. And then I punched her in the face. My fist connected with her nose, sending her sprawling. One of the ravens let out a pained shriek, exactly as I had hoped. The other raven hopped away through the forest and took flight, and I ran after it. My hand burned with a horrid fire, as though every nerve had been stabbed with a needle. I felt like I was being electrocuted, but despite the pain, I had to keep running. I fixed my eyes on the dark form of the raven as it swooped through the forest, struggling to keep it in sight while I crashed through the ferns and stinging plants. I followed it down a steep incline, over a creek and up an opposite hillside, a rock outcrop looming above me, and the raven landed upon it. Out of breath, I hauled myself upward until I saw I was standing on top of the rock alongside the raven. It pointed with his beak down the far side of the outcrop, where a talus slope faded out into a clearing. Something white was glinting down there on the edge of the forest. I carefully made my way down the talus slope towards it, and as I got closer, I realized it was a plane. I felt sick to my stomach again. There was only one plane it could be. One wing had separated from the aircraft and was bent around a tree, and the fuselage had split apart and tumbled across the forest floor. The fuel tanks inside the other wing had exploded, charring a section of the aircraft and incinerating all plants within several meters. The mangled remains of the cockpit lay at the inside of the debris trail, and that was where I went first, dreading what I would find. Sure enough, John was inside. A horrible shard of metal had twisted off during the crash and impaled him through the chest, pinning him to his seat. His eyes were glazed in death, with a pained expression on his face, and it was clear he hadn't died instantly. Then, on the seat next to him, I saw his passenger manifest, on which the only name was mine. Before he died, he had scrawled a message onto it. I reached over to grab the clipboard, careful not to brush against his blood-soaked shirt, and hauled it out. I held the manifest up to the moonlight and squinted at the words. Despite the shaky handwriting and the scattered drops of blood, it was clear what it had said. Follow the raven. Chills slithered down my spine as I read it. Yes, that was what he had written. As I stood there in shock, my mind worked furiously to understand a situation beyond my comprehension. I caught sight of the raven again. Its eyes were glittering in the darkness. "Where do you want to take me, huh?" I asked it. It hopped over to the back of the mangled cockpit and peered inside. I followed it over just in time to see it reach in and drag out something with its beak. It was the plane's emergency locator beacon, which sends out a distress signal if immersed in water. I was no longer surprised by the bird's intelligence. It was clear this wasn't merely a raven. I still wasn't sure who Raven was or what he wanted, but keeping John's words in mind, I took the locator beacon. Now I needed to submerge it in water. I let out a snort of amusement. Oh, haedekoi. There was nothing more plentiful. Only a few yards away was a small stream. I dropped the beacon into a pool and crossed my fingers. That was when I realized that my ordeal was far from over. It was the middle of the night, and I wasn't sure if anyone was looking for John's plane. And to make matters worse, I had punched a god, and I didn't think she would let that slide. I was starting to regret that decision a little bit. Maybe there was a better way to figure out which raven was the real one, and I had missed it. And where was Tekex and Tia? Surely they could manifest themselves right in front of me if they wanted to, even if they could only appear where death had taken place. That wouldn't be a problem, because John had died on this very spot. Just knowing his body was there was distressing. 2 old skeletons and a plane crash victim made for more dead people than I wanted to see in one night. I sat there in the forest for a long time, shivering in the cold and damp darkness. I didn't know where my campsite was, and I couldn't leave the crash site anyway, in case someone came to investigate the beacon. I prayed that I'd hear the sound of a helicopter before I saw the bright white forms of Tekex and Tia, but I had no such luck. After a few hours, I spotted Tia making her way down the talus slope, glowing white in the moonlight. There was no sign of Tekex. I figured that attempting to hide from a god was pointless, so I stayed right where I was, trying desperately to stay warm. I would have to confront her on her own terms. As Tia made her way through the wreckage of the plane, I was struck again by her beauty, but that only made me more afraid. I stood up from where I had been crouching and stared at her as she approached me. She stopped just a couple feet away, smiling broadly. "You are very brave, aren't you?" she said sweetly. I gulped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Oh, don't apologize," she said, reaching out to touch my shoulder. I shied away from her hand. "What do you want with me?" "I want you to stay here, to keep me company. Dead people are so boring. They all turn out the same after a while." All kinds of alarm bells were ringing in my brain. Clearly, I hadn't understood what they meant when they said they would take me home. Now I suspected they meant their home, not mine. I didn't know if this was meant the underworld or something worse. What did the Hyada believe? "Look," I said, "be straight with me. Why would I ever agree to stay with a couple of death gods?" "How could you say no?" Tia said with a bright and beautiful smile. No. There, I said it. You know you want to. I don't.
Really now?
Came a voice from behind me. It was Kix. I was starting to hyperventilate. There was nowhere to run. Not that it stopped me from trying. I launched myself into a mad dash into the debris-filled clearing, but I barely made it 3 meters before I felt a hand latch onto my arms. Tia held me there, still smiling sweetly. Don't run away, she crooned. There's nothing to be afraid of. In a moment of panic, I grabbed a twisted piece of wreckage with my free hand and swung it towards her. Even as I did, I realized it was a stupid idea, but it was too late. Tia let go of my arm and easily sidestepped the makeshift weapon, but she didn't stop smiling at me.
Drop it,
said Kix, who was circling around behind me.
You can't hurt me.
I moved to get behind Tia so I could keep her between Kix and myself. I knew Kix could kill me, being the god of violent death, but I suspected Tia couldn't. Peaceful death was almost always natural death. Killing is the antithesis. At least that's what I was hoping. Together we paced about the clearing in a sort of strange dance. They didn't want to hurt me, and I was too scared to hurt them. And then I noticed movement in the margins of the trees. My palms still get sweaty when I think about it. Pouring out of the forest were dozens and dozens of dead people. Most were mere skeletons, shambling along like puppets, their bleached bones clanging against one another in an unholy orchestra of terror. Dirt filled their vacant eye sockets. Insects scurried across the crumbling shoulders. Many of them had broken bones, smashed skulls, and slash marks on their limbs. I turned around me, and behind came more skeletons. They showed no sign of injuries. Violent death and peaceful death. To my even greater horror, I caught sight of John among the sea of animated corpse. He shuffled slowly forward, his eyes wobbling about in different directions, and his limbs beginning to swell with rigor mortis. The shard of broken metal was still sticking out of his chest as a grisly reminder of his violent end. There's nothing to be afraid of, said Tia. They can't hurt you. They're dead. What are you doing? I screamed. These are our only friends, she whispered to me. Cold, dead bones. They don't have much to talk about anymore. Your company would be so much better. Just then I heard the distant hum of a helicopter. Tia and Kix seemed to have noticed it too. I've never felt greater relief, before or since, than the moment I saw the chopper crest the ridge. Don't go with them. Stay here with me, please. Don't give me those freaking puppy dog eyes, I hissed. The helicopter was now hovering over the clearing, and I hailed the pilot with a wave. I wished I could tell them to hurry, because the skeletons were getting closer. The door of the helicopter opened, and a member of the search and rescue team acknowledged me as he began to descend with the casualty basket. He didn't seem to react to the presence of Kix and Tia, nor did he appear to care about the closing circle of animated skeletons that surrounded the clearing. He dropped to the ground between the two gods, walked right past Tia, and approached me. Are you hurt? He asked. No, I said. Just get me out of here. Hurry. Relax. There's no rush. Where's your gear? I don't know where it is. I don't know where I am. Just get me into the helicopter already. They're getting closer. I realized at that point that the rescuer didn't see anything out of the ordinary in the clearing, but he obliged me anyway, and we made for the basket. I dodged around Tia, who lunged out to grab me, but barely missed. I threw myself into the basket with both gods in hot pursuit. The rescuer climbed in and gave the thumbs up to raise it to the chopper, but Tia jumped in just before it began to rise. With a look of regret on her beautiful face, she pressed herself up against me and placed a hand over my heart. "You'll come with me," she whispered. A strange feeling of peace swept over my body. We were spinning around and around and around up into the darkness. My vision went black, and the last thing I heard was the caw of a raven. Before the basket reached the helicopter, I blacked out. When I came to, the helicopter was speeding back toward civilization. Paramedics stood over me with worried expressions on their faces. All of them were Haida. "Thank God," one of them said when I opened my eyes. "We thought you were gone. Your heart stopped for a bit there." There was no sign of Tia in the helicopter, to my immense relief. For some reason, the first thing I thought to ask was, "Will you go back for John?" They looked at each other confused. "Who?" "The seaplane pilot, the one that brought me out here." "You mean John Caxay? His plane crashed into the ocean a week ago. He did not survive." I almost had a second heart attack. It hadn't been 24 hours since he dropped me off at Sac Bay. My voice, thin and scared, asked, "Then whose plane crashed by the clearing where you picked me up? I used its emergency beacon." "There was no plane that crashed there." "Then how did you find me?" One of the paramedics leaned in close to my ear and whispered,
We followed the raven.
So quoth this raven.